Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. So, today is the Bernie Policypalooza. Just taking stock of the latest in big policies coming from the Sanders campaign. We should probably do one of these for Warren, too, at some point. But I think that this is just a bunch of stuff coming out from them recently. And
in part because I think Warren has been getting legitimately great press for pumping out a bunch of great policies. But I think it might have been less noticed that recently Bernie's campaign is putting out quite a few as well.
Yeah, and his are in some interesting areas, that are a little bit under noticed or some neglected stuff that hasn't been gotten a lot of attention. Maybe the place to start is the usury cap, if that's how you pronounce that, which would say it would give a percentage limit on consumer credit products of 15% interest. That's as much as you're allowed to charge, which, by the way, is still that's a considerable interest percentage. I think the federal funds rate is up to like 2% or something like that. You get a home mortgage, it's usually a few points higher than that, 5-6%, something like that.
But if you think of payday lenders or loan sharks, the percentage can be outrageous, or even many credit cards can be just outrageously high, right?
Yeah, credit cards, I think for your average person with good credit, it's usually about 14%, 15%. But if you get if you have bad credit, it's easily 22%, 26%, and maybe come down a little bit. But I remember, especially before the financial crisis, I think I had a credit card with 27% APR. And yeah, as you say, payday lending products, this will be it's typically like 10% over like a week or 2 weeks, So
yes.
You get a paycheck of $500, well, you got to pay $550 in 2 weeks. But if you work it out, the annual percentage rate is in the hundreds of percent.
Yes, exactly. Well, you know what I love most about how capitalism works, Ryan? It's that the people that have the least get the worst rates, and they get the harshest, most challenging obstacles, and that just makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, what you want to do is you want to take the poorest people that have the hardest time to get credit, and make them have to be squeezed all the more, which proportionally harms them exponentially more with things like payday lending. So that's the way you want to do it. You want to make inversely, the richer you are, the fewer obstacles you have, and the more power to dominate people you have, and then the worse off you are, the more you're screwed and squeezed by the system. That seems logical to me.
Yeah, and so payday lending would be basically driven out of business, I think. I don't know if you could make a profit on doing payday loans for 15%, whatever that would work out to be. It doesn't seem.
Do you want to explain to people how payday loans work?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said, you get your paycheck, and or you need need a loan to get you to your paycheck, and so you go to the payday loan shop, and they advance you the money
against your paycheck.
Yeah, against your paycheck, and then the charge is on top of that. So it's a typically 10-15% over a very, very short period, and so you got to pay them back 15% interest over the course of just a few days or weeks. And 15%, I don't know that these institutions could survive only, by cutting their revenue stream by like 95% or something. Maybe not. But there's some literature, suggesting that like under certain circumstances, like when a hurricane strikes and people have a lot of unexpected expenses, payday loans can be like a okay bridge. But there's also research suggesting that when payday loans move into an area, the overall financial security of the population goes down. I mean, it's just, it's a kind of thing where it's like, whatever is enabling this businesses to survive, it's got to be stopped. And so if the usury cap drives them out of business, and you have to do something to compensate so that poor people, still can feed themselves.
In other words, if you think of the loan sharks and the payday lenders as basically the mafia, people forget the mafia actually serve a purpose. Like they just like gangs serve a purpose. Gangs and the mafia have the role of filling the gap when institutional failure doesn't provide for people's basic economic or other forms of security, right? So now, of course, there's threat of violence, which, debt can be a form of a threat of violence as well. But if you remove the mafia, but you still have the problems in the neighborhood that the mafia was protecting you from, well, then you're still screwed, right? But it's a lose-lose situation because we want to get rid of the enforced violence that is pretending to be there for your benefit. Yeah.
And a maybe more interesting question has to do with credit cards. As we said, some of these cards they have a higher APR than 15%. And, the theory suggests that if you think, in just sort of classic economist terms, this should reduce the availability of consumer credit. It'd be harder to get credit cards. But one thing that kind of goes missing from the discussion about credit cards specifically is the incredible profit margins on credit cards. So I looked up Visa, the profits of Visa on a quarterly basis have gone up from $4.2 billion in 2007 to quarterly basis from 1.5 billion up to 5.5 billion in the last quarter in 2019, the most recent one. And meanwhile, the margin, the profit rate has increased. So from June 2007, it was 23.7%. In March 2019, for the last quarter, 54.19%. So these companies are just raking it in, and
just bilking people.
Yeah. And so people suggest as like, well, maybe the rewards programs get somewhat less generous. That may be true, but the fact is there's just an incredible amount of cream, you might say, in this market. And if Visa and MasterCard had to make do with only 23% profit for basically just pushing money around, which is very easy to do.
And this is your typical like liberal bourgeois response, like, what, you're going to save millions of people from devastation and indentured servitude, but you'll possibly harm my like travel, like my frequent flyer miles program might be different.
Yeah, and I mean, those frequent flyer programs, they do come at the expense of these interchange fees, and I think that they probably shouldn't exist. That it's just higher prices throughout the entire economy, and then they buy off their customers with these rewards programs. But more importantly, they're just making tons and tons of money. And one of the countering moves that Sanders and AOC, who co-sponsored this bill, this proposal is to put out postal banking, allow the post office to offer banking services, which it actually has done in the past, and it may even be legal to do it under existing law right now. And that would be just like, you basically have a vanilla like free checking or like very cheap checking and a very, just bare bones credit card and debit card that you could get, that anybody could get, and it's the kind of thing where like it wouldn't allow you to get into. It wouldn't do the thing where like you overdraft your account and they're charging you a $30 fee every time. It'd just be like very straightforward banking, and so that anybody could get, and that might allow this you know, the unbanked population, so to speak, to get access to basic financial services that would somewhat mitigate, you know, the loss of this. You know, like a big business in slums is just check cashing services. There's a lot of places that do that, and the percentage on those things is often like 9% or something. You know, a huge portion of your paycheck. And if you just had that real simple thing, you know, I mean, you shouldn't need these freaking ridiculous loan products to allow people to you know, make get from one paycheck to the next. And this may
While we're at it, can we say that overdraft fees and how they're used should be criminal? It's just like, yes, you have no money. I'm going to punish you for it and make you go into debt because you have no money in your bank account. And there have been lawsuits because that's legal. It's not even bad enough to just do that. But they abuse that and charge people overdraft when they shouldn't. And they've been, Bank of America, for example, was sued for tons and tons of money for fraudulently bilking people that have no money, right?
Yeah, I think the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, has somewhat cracked down on this, though it's probably been relaxed under Mick Mulvaney. But yeah, back in the day, they would do shit like rearrange your transaction order so that you dipped into
which came in first,
red temporarily, and then they would ding you for a whole bunch of fees. And yeah,
then everything that would come in would be like, oh, there's three $36 fees. Boom, boom, boom.
Yep. You know? Suddenly your whole paycheck's gone in a matter of minutes. So yeah, I think it's on balance a great proposal, you know? And I mean, you know, the background can... Go ahead.
I was going to say, is the strongest objection to it the frequent flyer mile objection, or is there other objections that you've heard?
I don't think there's any real strong objections to it, you know, and insofar like people actually do need payday loans, what they really need is higher wages. That's the problem. And that the middle class people don't go to payday loan shops almost never because they have enough cash flow to cover their daily expenses and a little cushion. That's all you need. You need to boost these
higher wages and combined with more free services or subsidized services.
Yeah. Get, you know, and provide some competition for these fucking credit card companies. You know, Visa and MasterCard are like 80% of the market. And, you know, this is why the profit margins are so big. And I think, you know, blunt force mechanisms to provide some competition and just force those profits down, it's got to be a good thing.
So you think postal banking is on offer from Bernie as well?
Yeah, he does support it. Yeah, he supports. Okay. Making another thing you could do, as Matt Brunig proposes, is you could just buy a bank. Like Ally Bank was briefly nationalized by the government and then sold, but you could just have a government bank. You just buy one and then not run it.
It's like a public option.
Yeah,
almost.
And then you could throw the ATMs in the. Post offices and so on. You know, I think that would be more or less equivalent way of doing the same thing. And it's all online, so the overhead is low. And so, anyway, yeah, I think it's a great idea. Let's do it.
All right. So we've got one policy, 2 thumbs up. What should we hit next?
I think the next one, which came out even more recently, is school desegregation. Bernie's got a big plan out to cut. It's sort of education reform, but focused especially on desegregation. And there's a whole bunch of. We'll link all this stuff because it's a pretty big proposal. He calls it the Thurgood Marshall.
A lot going on. Yeah.
Thurgood Marshall Plan for public education. And
very clever.
He wants to end the ban on busing to achieve integration, and this maybe requires a little bit of explanation, because the big, when Biden was rolling back desegregation efforts in the 70s, the big meme from people like Strom Thurmond and George Wallace was forced busing, right? So is creating a framework in which the imagined prior status quo was, everyone's going to their neighborhood school, and these federal bureaucrats are reaching in and they're forcing white families to bus their children to black schools. That's like that was what that's intended to suggest. But that frame is complete horseshit.
Right.
Busing is just the practice of using a bus to send your child to school. I rode a bus when I was in, I imagine you probably did. Most people listening to this probably did, gone on the bus at one point or another. And before Brown versus Board of Education and all the civil rights legislation, busing was a key part of how segregation was enforced. The very plaintiff in Brown versus Board of Education was bused to a black school, which was like 20 miles away from her house, and refused to allow to go to a white school, which was like 4 blocks away. So the stuff about busing is just to say that, like, can we use
public transit?
Can we use desegregation criteria to select our student population, who gets to go to what school? And that's banned as a result of shit that Biden passed back in the 70s with Strom Thurmond and James Eastland and other, KKK adjacent people.
So specifically, what does that mean in terms of what would be allowed that's that is not currently allowed, in terms of, okay, you're a family that lives in a certain area and you're supposed to go to this school, but you actually want to go to that school. How would that play out, that change?
So the currently you can't use federal dollars to there's like tons of education grants that are coming out of the Department of Education all the time, and you can't use any of that money that's earmarked for transportation to integrate your school districts. And so what this would allow is for school districts, and in fact it would provide a lot of incentives for them to do this, to when they are selecting, they're allocating their students, they could use buses again to try to mix up the demographic categories to get a good balance, and to
so someone who is presumably less well off could use a public bus in order to go to a better school in an area that would integrate those people of color with the richer white school, basically.
Well, I don't think it's public school bus, but I'm talking about, like, the big yellow buses that are just for students.
Yeah.
That
right.
kind of thing.
School.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. School bus. Yeah. But all I'm saying is that the ability to go to a school out of your area could be justified based on the fact that you are integrating, right, demographically, by going that distance, right? And so you have a new basis upon which you could go to a school that before you couldn't choose to go to, based on this criteria, that it would be integration.
Yes, and in fact, it would provide a big pot of money to incentivize that sort of thing. Be like, if your school wants to get some integration in place, because the sort of background reality here is that the federal government doesn't have all that much influence over how schools are working. They're mostly locally controlled. But, you could say, you want to integrate your school, here's some grants and so on. But another thing he would do is bring back court-ordered desegregation, which used to be a big thing and was mostly rolled back in the 80s and 90s, where you'd have, schools with a rural history. I think they were largely in the South, though not entirely, where the courts would basically force them to integrate their school district, because there's a lot of districts, for example, that, would have, a big population of people, and there would be like, 4 white schools and then like 2 black schools, and the almost all the black people went there, especially the poor ones, and those ones were just like really shitty. And the purpose was just sort of like quarantine the black population in these schools and like starve them of resources and so on. And there are a lot of these court-ordered desegregation things are really successful because they could penalize the district to be like, if you don't get to this demographic target, we're going to fine you $100 million or something like that, and they step
right.
to it.
They're not going to. Yeah, exactly.
And
what
one final thing here, that there's a very interesting article in the Tampa Bay Times from back in like 2015 in the 5 worst elementary schools in Florida, and they were all in Pinellas County, which is affluent. I may be pronouncing that wrong. And as recently as 2007, all 5 of them were average or better. And what happened was the county got out from under a federal desegregation order, and they just instantly resegregated the schools. And they stuffed all the poor black people in the county into these 5 dog shit schools, got less money, and then it was all concentrated poverty as well, which is really bad for education. And so you had like tons of turnover and, like incompetent management, a lot of violence in the schools and so on. And their test scores just fell right through the floor. And, there's just all this hullabaloo over this. Some pretty, desperate stories from, lower middle class black families that are like doubling up to get out of these crappy schools. And I think it shows you 2 things here. That number one, the segregationist impulse is absolutely as alive and well today as it was in like 1960. And the theory behind getting out from under the desegregation order is like, look, we've been compliant. We did it, we're all good. You don't need to look over us anymore. And the second, they got out from under it, it was like, boom. We were lying, sorry. But another, maybe more interesting part of this is that there was no corresponding increase in really high-performing white schools. There's like one that did like better a bit. But it's not as if, segregating all the poor black people in these schools meant that all the white kids were getting a correspondingly better education.
Not that would be okay. Like, even if it were true, that would still not be a justification for it. But it's not even true. No.
And so there's literally no downside to this, in terms of the educational achievement. And I would say, you're living in a multi-ethnic, multicultural society. It's arguably a benefit to go to an integrated school where you have lots of contact with other cultures, and you're not just like the Covington, Kentucky kids, or you're stuck in, fucking MAGA, dome of whiteness and privilege. And the second you go to DC and then black Israelites start yelling at you, then you just panic and start being incredibly racist.
Well, and so it's not only that it's good for any number of reasons to integrate for some of the rationales you just gave, but also it's a form of protection against people of color who, when concentrated, can be harmed with these broad stroke policies that don't care about these populations, since they're all integrate, or they're all kind of concentrated together. But if you integrate them with kind of the white privileged kids who are otherwise protected, then that serves as a form of protection for the people of color who've been integrated into those school systems, right? Because now you would be harming the white privileged kids, and God knows that's not going to happen, right? So that's another form of kind kind of not just protection against harm, but way to ensure the kind of environment in which people of all, colors and ethnicities can flourish.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like the great benefit of universal social insurance is that you harness the fate of the poor to the fate of the middle class and the rich. And if everyone's getting more or less the same services, then
they're bound up together.
Yeah, and I don't think, this isn't a panacea for education. Poor black people, even in integrated schools, often don't do that well. But they do a lot better than they...
The one, I think this is still true, I believe, that the most statistically significant factor in your education leading to, basically what can predict success in school from K through 12 to college and beyond is household income.
Yeah, I'm almost certainly true. That's the case. Yeah,
more than the wealth of the particular school district, more than any of these other variables. That's the one. So yeah, of course, that still has to be addressed. But this is part and parcel of a broader, education policy that Bernie's offering. There's, we want to talk about what he's saying with regard to charter schools a bit, or his other educational policies.
Yeah, he wants to ban for-profit charter schools. And he supports the NAACP's moratorium on public funds for charter schools until they've done a national audit. And it's not like banning charters outright, but, making them comply with same oversight. So let's see, mandating that at least half of all charter school boards members are teachers and parents. Disclosing stuff, allowing for labor unions to get into charters. And it's funny, John Chait wrote a piece accusing him of racism because charter schools are broadly popular in the black community, and some of them are...
Can always rely on Chait.
As usual, did not disclose the fact that his wife is a charter school lobbyist. But... you look at the data, and Chait constantly exaggerates the efficacy of charter schools. If you look at the data as Rachel Cohen has done, some charter schools are better, some are a lot worse than public schools. I think on average, in terms of student achievement, really not that different. But they also have this anti-labor, anti-public provision of social goods ideology to them that I think is very toxic and
pernicious. Yeah, absolutely.
And
the for-profit ones are especially not.
Oh great. Yeah. That is totally unjustifiable. These people make money by advertising, and tricking people into coming to these scummy schools, and a lot of them are just appallingly poorly managed. The third big thing, he wants to try to even out the funding for public schools. The way public schools are funded is just so grossly unjust.
Perverse.
Local property tax revenue is just, it's like, yeah, the rich get all the resources and poor get nothing. And, so he's got a variety of mechanisms to try to, again, these are locally controlled, so you can't just overturn it nationally, but trying to, legally mandate this and provide some money over here to try to top things up.
Right.
And
so because of federalism, the best that, the president of the United States could do is to create incentives and induce state and local governments to do what's right and adhere to a more equitable way of funding education.
Yeah,
right?
And there's a lot of things that he could do. There's a lot of little federal incentives and rules and stuff that you could change to try to spread that out. To have it
people might not realize the reason that we have a drinking age that's uniform across all states, because that's something that states should determine what the drinking age is. That's because of something exactly like that. the kind of requirements that to get funding for the highways from the federal government, you have to have, the particular age limit before you can purchase alcohol. So it's exactly the kind of bargain that the federal government sometimes has with states to mandate something that otherwise would be totally state and locally controlled.
Yeah. But this, there's more to it, but I think, we covered most of the big parts. And he also wants to boost up teacher pay a lot and expand after school and summer education stuff.
Right, like a floor for teacher pay. That'd be cool.
Universal school meals. Everybody gets the same school lunch
for free.
So none of the stigma of free lunch. Free lunch kids getting the PB&J or whatever. From
right.
So yeah, this is, I'd say the ideas are good, but I think as a rhetorical strategy, it's very pleasing to see him coming in to bringing back desegregation as an important topic, because it's still a huge fucking problem, and
yes.
It's gotten worse since the 1970s. When there were all these court orders and stuff, and 1980s. So, to see Biden, who is a big part of why schools are so segregated now, still standing by his record, working with James Eastland to beat back school integration. That's a pretty stark contrast.
What a foil that Biden is for Bernie. I mean, he's also the bankruptcy reform guy in bed with the credit card companies. So almost every policy we're talking about, he is the exact opposite side of.
Yeah, absolute stooge for Israel. It just goes on and on. Voted for the Iraq War. Financial deregulation. War on crime. But yeah, I think that's good. Let's see. We move on. So, other big Bernie policy, Medicare for all, obviously. Like, that's his signature thing.
Is he more bold? It sounds weird because to say Medicare for all suggests the same thing, but you hear other candidates that hedge. Elizabeth Warren seems close to his proposal, but then when you get to Kamala Harris, then it's a little less clear, and then you devolve to people who are like, no, public option, right? So can we clarify how different or distinct his proposal is from others?
Well, most of the big candidates have endorsed Bernie's bill. Most of the senators, I think Harris has, I think Warren has, Kristen Gillibrand has, but Bernie is clearly the only one who actually thinks it's like a real priority for him. Harris has backed off in her rhetorical statements, saying like, well, we don't want to move too fast. Warren's clearly not that into it either.
Yeah, maybe this is worth parsing, supporting someone else's bill and what that means in terms of an endorsement versus how we can measure actual principled support for something that is categorically different from some compromised policy.
Yeah.
Right?
And yeah, under, Medicare for all, you obviously everyone's on Medicare, but Bernie would also change it so that it would cover, if I'm not mistaken, you cover all primary care, inpatient, outpatient, nursing coverage, plus dental and vision and prescription drugs. And
what about psychological?
There would be no copays or deductibles or premiums, no costs except for prescription drugs, but those would be capped at $250 a year. So
nice.
Some small copays or certain things, but the cap on it is very small. This would be really, really good insurance, probably better than virtually anyone in the entire country has today. And it would be accepted everywhere. And the private insurance industry would be forbidden from duplicating any of that coverage. And so they would go down to a vestigial thing with some like supportive, a few supplemental policies here and there. So,
right.
And what there's always what would it cost, and it depends really on how aggressive you want to get with prices. So currently the U.S. spends about $1 trillion more relative to the size of our economy than the second most expensive country in the world, which is Switzerland. And I came up with a sort of back of the envelope estimate to say that you could almost certainly squeeze out about $800 billion in just pure waste. And however much you wanted to do that just depends on how bold you want to get. And it's a problem because hospitals themselves don't even know where the real what their shit costs. There is a great Wall Street Journal article about what a hospital trying to figure out what it actually costs them to do a knee surgery for which they charge $50,000 about, and their result was about $10,000. So you need to do basically a massive audit of the entire medical sector.
That's right.
And you could do global budgeting. You could, other countries do fee for service, and it's actually fine. But you just have to have a really hard ass bureaucracy to make sure that you're getting a good deal for your money, and the hospitals aren't ripping you off. Because I think most hospitals you'd have. United States spends 8% of its health and its medical money on administration, and we have the worst administrative system of any medical, any other country by far. I mean, it's gotten a lot worse under electronic medical records. I don't know if you've noticed this, but been a lot of studies on this about losing documents, losing paperwork, referrals getting lost, scans not being sent. I mean, if you've had any contact with the medical system and you had to bounce back and forth between different providers, it's just fucking dog shit. And so Canada spends 3%. I'd be able to get that down, get prescription drugs down. It'd probably required, printing or some tax bump or whatever, but I don't think it's remotely outside of our capacity. And total, even the Koch-funded Mercatus Center guy, Charles Blahouse, found that it would cut total medical spending by $2 trillion over 10 years.
Right. So when you think of the cost, the rhetoric on the right is to talk about just how your taxes might go up without mentioning how your actual out-of-pocket costs for your insurance and your medical procedures goes to zero or almost nothing. And so they don't talk about the overall net gain that most people will have. Some rich people maybe overall will be more expensive, but most people will have much better service, much better coverage, lives will be saved, and overall the economy is probably going to net gain from this change, I would say, right?
Yeah, I mean, you think, the discourse around cost is all about the taxes. But I think the way to think about it is just how much of national income is being dedicated to the medical system.
That's right.
And are we getting a good value for our money? And the answer is no. We're spending last time I checked, 17.3, I think, % of GDP on the health spending. And Switzerland, as I said before, is second cheapest. They're at 12.3%. Other countries, France is at, I think, 9 or 10%. UK is at 7, 8%. Japan is at, I think, 7 or 8%. And all of them have better outcomes than the U.S. in a lot of areas. We do pretty well on cancer survival rates, but on the other hand, I think
infant mortality rate is
42% of cancer patients lose their entire life savings within 2 years. I think I saw a study on this.
Medical bankruptcies are outrageous.
We're not bad on heart attack survival, but we are dog shit. We're really terrible on infant mortality and maternal mortality. and life expectancy is declining. So
all the more disproportionately harming people of color.
Yes,
women of color, especially,
and poor people. Yeah, black women in particular just get absolutely screwed. Pregnant black women, like you're better off in Cuba by a considerable margin. So yeah, just to sum up, it's like we're dedicating this proportion of our economy for middling to shitty performance along every metric. Meanwhile, the burden of complexity it places on average citizens is absolutely psychotic.
So that's the thing, right? So if you've read Corey Robin's great piece from years ago about socialism as converting horrible misery into ordinary and happiness.
Yeah.
In part, that was about reducing all that terrible, like the paradox of choice, having so many choices, quote unquote, that actually just make you so anxious you don't know what to do. You have too many 401ks if you're lucky to choose from. You're just bombarded with paperwork and with decisions, and you have to constantly gain knowledge unless you get screwed because you missed, paying for something you didn't realize you had to pay for, and then you go bankrupt. All of these things compound in capitalism, right? The stress, anxiety, and terrible kind of form of life you have to experience, that gets totally taken away, right? The opportunity cost of all that misery and time and energy is wiped clean. But also the forms of domination and oppression that, look, most people get their insurance through their employer. This would get rid of that necessity. So you can no longer, as we talked about with Corey Robin, no longer feel like your boss can control when you go to the bathroom, in part because your boss controls your medical, like your actual life, because he can fire you at will and you lose your ability to get treated medically for that reason. So you feel like you have to just submit to the domination of your employer. Like that form of freedom, not just economic, but that form of freedom, that emancipation, which we talked a bit about with Nancy Fraser in the last episode, is on offer. So when we think of comparing somebody like, I don't know if it's Mayor Pete or Beto, who might say, I'm in favor of quote unquote universal health coverage, which is really code for some combination of a public option and private health insurance. They really don't give a shit about those forms of domination that would persist, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And this would just be such a more logical and just if you could actually do this and once people got the hang of it, it would be so great. People would love it. It would be like, wait, no more paperwork? I just go to the doctor whenever I feel sick? Holy shit.
Right.
Yeah, maybe.
Which would reduce costs also because the people get preventative checkups, right? And things would be caught earlier. Obviously, people have talked about this quite a bit.
Yeah. And you just wouldn't have that stress. I mean, I remember I fainted one time and collapsed in the bathroom, and I woke up.
You had to take an Uber, right?
Yeah. Well, it called 911, and my first thought when I came to was like, "Oh, don't do that. Don't call 911. I don't want an ambulance bill. It could be $2,000. I'll walk to the hospital."
Right. What a sick.
Yeah. The way that there's so much of that burden that so many people just carry around all the time, and if you could just pull that off, it'd just be like, oh, like you're walking with a backpack full of boulders around all the time. Just be like, oh, holy shit, this is great.
I mean, Judith Butler talks about precariousness and precarity, and she says that, like, technically everyone has a precarious life in the sense that we're all mortal. We could all die at any moment, be hit by a bus, have a heart attack, what have you. But politically and economically, this system that we're in, that is the status quo, chooses to disproportionately force enhanced precarity on different populations of people. And these are the types of policies that try to fight against that and remove that disproportionate precarity.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, let's do a couple more of his more under notice policies here.
Sure.
There's he has a great big farm thing that he just put out that didn't get very much attention at all. But he wants to restructure the whole farm like marketplace and economy, to change how it works. So there's a lot of it. So there's a big bunch of antitrust stuff he wants to do. So bust up a lot of these big agribusiness. It's like few companies own most of the pork packing industries. 4 companies slaughter 85% of beef cattle. Soybean sales from the largest 4 sellers rose from 51 to 76% between 2000 and 2015. 2 largest conglomerates now control 78% of the corn seed market. So break up a bunch of them, and he wants to do put a moratorium on vertical integration. Where you have one company like owning the all points of the production process. He wants to do right to repair for farm equipment. It's sort of like Apple, where they ban third-party repair shops from working on their stuff. So, like, if you have a John Deere tractor and you want to fix it, you just have to take it back to John Deere, where they, charge you a huge margin to repair it. Skipping over a few things, fair trade deals, make it so that the domestic farm market is protected from, unfair competition, and also is fair on the other side of the equation, where you're not just dumping dirt cheap soybeans onto the overseas market.
Right.
Then he wants to do a bunch of price regulation, which is maybe the most interesting thing. So it's got a supply management program so that you have like a steady supply. You don't have, as what happens now, there's often like quick shortages or huge surpluses of grains and stuff that build up. He wants to put together a national grain and feed reserve, to deal with stuff like the massive flooding in the Mississippi basin. Reform the structure of agricultural subsidies so that more of it goes to smaller farms. Then he wants a parity system so that farmers can make like as much money as equivalent, similar workers in other sectors of the economy. This is a classic George McGovern thing. So, you have a sort of price, when it's set a price floor on certain markets so that the growers are always making at least enough that they are paid roughly the same as, industrial workers.
So how would you characterize this approach? It's like the two Roosevelts, like Teddy Roosevelt and FDR a little bit. It's because I think it would be good, and we'll do this with Warren as well, to try to couch all the policies together that we cover or that we see in terms of some overarching approach to change into policy. So how does this fit into that, do you think?
I would say this is, broadly speaking, sort of Brandeisian policy. It's kind of funny. He's kind of horning in on Elizabeth Warren's turf a little bit. But the idea is not to socialize the farm sector, though he does say he wants to incentivize cooperatives, rural electric cooperatives, food co-ops, credit unions, which tend to pay better and produce better quality food. But so instead of we're going to nationalize Monsanto or whatever, he says,
right,
let's just totally restructure the entire farm marketplace so that the businesses are smaller and that the prices are regulated such that they don't go, they don't produce socially disastrous effects. And this is, is a classic part of the New Deal, was to head off, the situation where farmers would see a price collapse of their whatever they're growing, and then they would grow more to compensate. They plant more of the crop, and then the price would just decline even more, and these people were just caught chasing their own tail. And so there's a lot of this stuff that still exists in the USDA, that they do things called marketing orders, which is sort of just like a big agreement among producers of stuff like raisins. One of these things was declared unconstitutional by John Roberts a couple years ago. But the point being that you're coordinating production such that the price doesn't go too high, when it doesn't go too low, and it doesn't. You ensure a steady supply, but not too much. So
it's like it controls the price.
Yeah, but definitely a certain form of price controls. You're not dictating to people exactly what they can charge, but you could say, oh yeah, price floors, right, and so on. And these programs are incredibly successful in the New Deal. It's kind of a pain in the ass, but farming is a weird business. It's you plant in the spring and then you harvest later, and shit can go wrong. And but on the other hand, like, you need food. Everyone needs food, and I think this is go ahead.
No. Finish your thought. I was just going to say that this, to put on the horse race cap for a moment, this will probably play pretty well in Iowa, I would think.
Yeah. Iowa's getting the whole farm belt's just getting totally fucked by Trump's trade war. Like, we export a ton of soybeans to China, and they've been punishing, specifically, I think they're specifically punishing Trump states, like picking out what's grown in Iowa and so on, to try to maybe swoop.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that it's had an effect on the real strong Trump supporters that are farmers even.
Oh, no, not the real strong ones, but I think it's definitely dented maybe. His support's gone down by double digits in every one of these states.
Right.
There'll always be that hardcore people who just love him. They're dying of measles and starvation,
or dying of whiteness, or as they're dying of whiteness, as a great new book discusses. Right.
Yeah, exactly. It's just it's the fucking Twinkie of politics. There's just no nourishment to it. You're just these empty calories that are going to make you die of political rickets.
Nice. Trump is a fascist Twinkie. I like
it. Quickly, one more.
And don't forget, I'm not sure which one you're going to pick, but don't forget, even if we don't get into it, mentioning how he's the only one, as far as I know, to stand up for felons to be able to vote, right?
Yeah, I was actually just going to move to that one real quick. Criminal justice reform. Yeah, so he wants to allow all ex-cons and all current prisoners to vote, which is that's a laudable stance, because that is not popular. That is very unpopular. Right. But I think it's one of those things that, like, it hasn't even been discussed yet, and it's one that sounds weird to people, but the more you think about it, the more it's like, actually, that seems fine. But he also wants to end the war on drugs, legalize pot, and ban cash bail. All three of those are...
Which, I don't know, that last one especially, constitutionally, again, we run into problems with who actually has control over such things.
This would have to be some sort of incentive thing. I don't think you could ban it. But the current, bail rules are heavily influenced by the government, and they have a lot of leverage over that. And, 2/3 of people in jails, as opposed to prisons, a place where you go before you have a trial or a guilty plea or whatever, 2/3 of those people have not been convicted of a crime. Or, actually, no, 60%. And there's like 700-something thousand people in jails. And most of those people they've not been convicted, rather, that are there because they can't pay their bail. And that's just a completely horrible...
And then that's so often used to force or help pressure and induce a plea bargain, which accounts for This might just be at the federal level. I believe 97% of all convictions are plea bargains. There's only 3% go to trial. It might be the federal level, but just an outrageous form.
Yeah. 90+%, I'm pretty sure, at all levels.
At all levels, yeah.
And they don't, it's like there's so many prisoners, like the system has been so hollowed out, and the number of people being incarcerated on a daily basis is that they can't possibly do that many trials. And so there's just this enormous pressure to just stack up the charges, coerce a guilty plea, move on to the next person.
Well, and who's in prison has very little to do with who is quote unquote guilty of anything. We've talked about Foucault before. We've talked about mass incarceration before. But this is a form criminalization, the way that the laws interact with the prison system, both the for-profit prison industry and just the regular way that criminal law and policing works, is to just punish, abuse, and harm disproportionately those populations of poor and color who do not have the power to fight against it or to pay to get out of bail or to get a good lawyer, right? It's just an incredible injustice system where there is almost nothing going on except state-sanctioned abuse and harm.
Yeah, yeah. And this, legalizing pot sounds like a total gimme, but that's still a big thing in a lot of the country. It's like counties in Georgia where half the arrests are pot possession, and most of them don't go anywhere. But it's just like, Jesus, get the state out of people's lives in this. It's just
it's a form of social control.
Yeah,
right? It's just
a way for police to just be able to hassle anybody they want. I think, let me see here, maybe two more quick ones. Wants to do a massive bailout of Puerto Rico. So huge reconstruction package to clean up the mess after the hurricanes from 2017, which has not been remotely fixed. And he also wants to get rid of the Promesa dictatorship, which is this thing that President Obama signed in 2016, which placed basically the government of Puerto Rico as a bunch of unelected technocrats, and there's one guy from like the Heritage Foundation and a bunch of other bankers, and they're just bleeding the place dry, so he would restore the sovereignty that it had, at least before this thing, and do a big debt write-down and reconstruction package to get Puerto Rico back on a sound economic footing so that it can stop hemorrhaging population and, return to health.
I think the theme you see with all this is, and I know you have another one that you want to mention, but don't you think the theme is there are state and market-based forms of domination, oppression, and harm, which of course work together. They're conceptually distinct, but they operate together, right? And these policies attack different forms of oppression, and so are emancipatory, whether the liberation or emancipation is coming from state violence and harm or from, the quote-unquote self-regulating market and the harms that come from that. They all seem to be aimed at some type of emancipation against those two forms or sources of oppression.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing he doesn't mention on his Puerto Rico policy page is statehood,
which he should. DC and Puerto Rico, right, should be.
Yeah, and he does. I think he does support statehood in theory, but it's not like it is just like they got to vote for it. But I would almost certain that if it were to come up for a vote, he would support that.
Right. And that's a little complicated because there is the self-determination aspect. Like, does Puerto Rico want to become a state? And if at present, the people don't, is it paternalistic to try to kind of move them in that direction? This redounds back to the same Vanguard problem we've talked about before, though.
Yeah.
I think
they've had a couple of referenda in which the statehood did win. And I think it's pretty clear to me that that's really the only realistic option for it, because their current status sucks. But if they're an independent country, then you're stuck with this ruined infrastructure, no money from the United States government anymore, and then you're probably mostly defenseless from vulture capitalist predation.
Right.
And if they were to become a state, then you could be, at least in theory, something like any other state. And more importantly, you would have people in Congress who could go and raise hell, and they could gum up the wheels of government and until their needs are met, and get the bailout and the reconstruction that they so clearly deserve for this and 50, 100 years previously of colonial imperialism. So, but I guess at the end of the day, it is up to them.
It's up to them. It would be nice in the Senate to have D.C. and Puerto Rico, to have another 4 senators on the side of the left, possibly, to kind of prevent the tremendous obstacle that the Senate is to getting any legislation passed in Congress.
God.
But yeah, final thoughts on all these policies, or Bernie?
Could maybe just take us out here is talk about his climate policy. And this is a place where I think there's going to be, what he has now is a pretty thin just bunch of bullet points. And so it's like, I don't know, it's just a couple of paragraphs, whereas the farm thing is like several pages long. The usury thing
we'll
is
link to this.
Long, yeah. This one, he's saying all the right things: pass a Green New Deal, invest in infrastructure, reduce carbon emissions from our transportation system, ban fracking, and keep it in the ground by banning fossil fuel leases on public lands, end export of coal, natural gas, and crude oil. So those are some pretty radical measures. But in terms of a whole worked out approach, the Green New Deal thing is just like 2 sentences. What does that look like?
Right.
Right. And Jay Inslee has a pretty worked out climate change thing. That's his signature issue. And so I would expect Bernie in the next week or two to come out with something that is real aggressive. And
that's the other thing I was going to say. So this is one example, but what else should Bernie and his campaign fill in the details of, or propose that they aren't, or what are some of the flaws that they need to work on? I guess that's one that you pointed to. Draw on the more extensive, expansive, fleshed out policy of Jay Inslee. I think maybe Elizabeth Warren's. There's a mention in Bernie's policies about student debt and reducing it by some significant amount, but it's not nearly as bold or fleshed out as Elizabeth Warren's, for example.
Well, he does support free college.
Right.
So that would deal with it going forward. He doesn't have a debt forgiveness thing. I get the least I would expect him to support reforming bankruptcy so that people with lots of student debt could just get rid of it.
Could discharge it.
Yeah. His expand Social Security page is very short. It's 1 bullet point. Expand and extend Social Security for the next 52 years by making sure that all income over $250,000 a year is subject to the Social Security payroll tax, the Social Security Expansion Act. And I suppose that would be in the details would be in there, but it would be nice to see that in the, how much are we expanding it, and how much money is that going to raise? But
here's the other thing, because we've talked about this before. On the one hand, you want more details to flesh out exactly how things work and the specifics, and you want to make sure it's not just a bunch of hot air and promises. On the other hand, a lot of lefty ideals and utopian demands have been crushed by people who, at the very inception, before there's any political will generated by promoting these ideas, just the Iglesias of the world, or the kind of the wonks want to demand all the details right now resolved perfectly before we can even permit discussion of a policy as a proposal.
Right.
So that's the other harm, right?
Yeah. There's no sense in pissing about too much to write bills that will never pass, or that you could write later, but I think you want to hit basically a sort of happy medium, where it's pretty clear what you want to do. You don't have to dot every I and cross every T, but you also don't want it to just be super vague at the same time. Yeah.
And as we talked about with Robert Hockett about the Green New Deal, a lot of details should perhaps be determined collectively and democratically at kind of national and state and local levels. And to do it top down is kind of inimical to the way that it should be figured out, and certain principles should be espoused. And I pressed him on it, and he thought the job guarantee might be something that is both pragmatic, but in principle is something the left should push for. So there are some things that are both a means to an end, but also ends in themselves. But overall, do you think Bernie has struck that balance in not erring on either side too much?
Yeah, I mean. If I think for the most part, he's pretty close. The one thing I would like to see, thinking about it again, is a bunch of day one stuff. It's you're inaugurated. What executive orders are you going to issue on day one?
Yeah. Or first 100 days. What do you want to get done the first 100 days?
And what would he he has a little thing about getting money out of politics. Restore the Voter Rights Act, automatic voter registration, get rid of Citizens United, voter IDs, make Election Day a national holiday.
He can't really get rid of Citizens United himself, obviously. No. But to support the ways in which that might come about, I suppose.
Try to do it, yeah. And
what are the priorities?
How else would he restructure? I mean, in particular, I would say thinking about this from a frame of how do you empower the left, and DC and Puerto Rico statehood is
could be high up there. Right?
That's it's probably the only way that the Democrats are ever going to be able to hold on to the Senate for any length of time,
right?
Because they're at a -6 handicap right now, or something like that, given just the way that the partisan balance of states happens to sit.
Makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, so I would like to see more discussion about that. The sort of the strategy of building power structurally, but. It's pretty good.
I imagine he would say Medicare for all would probably be high up on the priority list, is my guess.
Yeah. Boy, imagine passing that through this Senate. But
it's exciting
overall.
But pretty good overall.
It's rich. There's a ton of stuff in there, and even if it's incomplete, almost every single idea is pretty worthy.
Very principled, very, not like you said, I don't know if it was the last episode or this episode about Biden. He's not negotiating with himself. He's going bold and principled.
Yeah. Yeah. Negotiations 101. This is the art of the deal, baby. You make you when you go to buy the rug at the flea market, you lowball them. That's what, conversely, you're selling the rug, you highball them. You want to see what you can get. See how much you can swindle out of these dumb tourists.
The dumb tourists being the Republicans.
Yeah. And
the neoliberal Democrats.
Yeah. And that, it's a vision of a kind of confidence that did we talk about the New York Times interview?
No, we should get to it.
Yeah.
Let's wrap it up with that.
Yeah,
which is a beautiful,
this just wonderful interview where the the New York Times woman Sydney Ember was trying to get him to apologize for an anti-war rally opposing Reagan's funding of the Contra death squads in Nicaragua in the 1980s. Apparently, somebody at that has somebody was saying, "Here, there, everywhere, the Yankee will die," and Sanders just brushes her off. Says.
Yeah,
my point was that she asked. My point is, if I wanted to know if you had heard that, and he says, "I don't remember. No, of course there was anti-American sentiment there. This was a war being funded by the United States against the people of Nicaragua. People were being killed in that war." Then she asked, "Do you think if you had heard that directly, you would have stayed at the rally?" And he says, "I think, Sydney, with all due respect, you don't understand a word that I'm saying."
No, what's true is that the New York Times, at least this reporter, but so many of the quote progressive neoliberals are concerned with civility and literally are more concerned with quote unquote anti-American rhetoric or language as opposed to the actual war crimes committed by the United States that the protest is about.
Yeah.
I mean, if that doesn't just typify this, as you say, limp dish rag milquetoast liberalism, I don't know what does. And finally, somebody on the left is like, hello, Bueller, the Sandinistas, that was the right side to be on.
Yeah.
The side against the Contras who were killing nuns and children and just being funded by the U.S. government.
Yeah. And that confidence, and that's a lesson Trump can teach. I mean, that you can bluster through just about anything, but especially here where he's absolutely in the right and is just like, fuck you. Like, what kind of a stupid question is this? You didn't say that exactly, but
in those words, but that was the implication.
Yeah. So
and the questions we ask matter, right? The questions we ask matter, and that question gave so much away. And I'm glad that the answer isn't some concession to the question. So that and the foreign policy that flows from that is maybe one of the things, as we talk about Warren, maybe in a future episode, that might distinguish him from all the other candidates. We think he and Elizabeth Warren are a category apart from everyone else, but between the two of them, it might be foreign policy and the way that he sees capitalism and imperialism operating together as part and parcel of the same global project. That might distinguish him from Warren, actually.
Yeah, I think so. She's much more of a squish. She's gotten better, but she's clearly not. She was clearly not demonstrating in favor of the Sandinistas in the 1980s. I will lay good money on that.
Yeah. All right, everybody. That was a good talk, my friend. I think we should do this as much as the candidates actually have enough to dig into. We should do this for others.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good idea. But thanks for listening, everyone. And
thanks, everybody.
We'll see you next time.
Last but not least, we have a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon. You can support the show with $5 a month and get an extra episode every week. We really appreciate the support, and it helps us keep this going.